German pilots themselves were among the first to recognize that American industry had become an unstoppable colossus. During the Bitter Tunisia campaign, Major Johannes Steinhoff, commander of Jägerschwader 77, confessed in December 1942, "The American pilots are no longer amateurs. Most disturbing of all, there seem to be more of them every single day." This realization only accelerated as the months passed. On January 27, 1943, the United States launched its very first bombing raid on Germany itself, 64 heavy bombers thundering toward Wilhelmshaven. By that October, during the infamous Black Thursday raid on Schweinfurt, the Americans could lose 60 B-17 flying fortresses in a single day and still replace them within 2 weeks. The cold mathematics were becoming inescapable. The climax arrived in February 1944, during what came to be known as Big Week. Between February 20th and 25th, the U.S. 8th and 15th Air Forces unleashed an astonishing 3,500 bomber sorties against German aircraft plants. The Luftwaffe lost between 262 and 355 fighters, but the real catastrophe was the death of approximately 100 irreplaceable veteran pilots. General Adolf Galland grimly reported to Göring that Germany was losing about 1,200 fighters every month while producing only 1,000. Meanwhile, America was producing 2,500 fighters monthly while losing just 400. Major Heinz Bahr, one of Germany's most accomplished aces with over 220 victories, described with awe and despair a mission in January 1944 over Brunswick. "The bomber stream stretched from horizon to horizon," he recalled. "At least 700 flying fortresses and liberators. We were 8 fighters against hundreds. It was hopeless." By 1944, American aircraft production had reached proportions that seemed almost supernatural. In that year alone, U.S. factories turned out 96,270 aircraft, 16,048 four-engine bombers, 35,743 fighters, and 22,591 multi-engine support planes. In just 12 months, America produced more aircraft than Germany managed in the entire war, approximately 94,677, but the disparity was not merely in numbers. It was in quality, firepower, and resilience. Each American heavy bomber bristled with 13.50 caliber Browning machine guns, fed by thousands of rounds of ammunition. German fighters, by contrast, often launched with half-loaded belts due to shortages. American bombers boasted powered gun turrets, precision Norden bomb sights, and advanced navigation instruments. German aircraft, increasingly cobbled together in underground factories, often lacked even functioning radios. That by May 1944, Boeing's Seattle Plant No. 2 was producing 16 B-17s every single day. Douglas Aircraft, which had employed just 68 people in 1936, now had a workforce of 167,000 spread across 9 sprawling facilities. North American Aviation was building 500 P-51 Mustangs per month. Lockheed's lines were turning out 1 P-38 Lightning every 90 minutes, while simultaneously incorporating more than 2,000 combat-driven modifications into its design. Supporting industries surged forward in parallel. General Motors produced 57,658 aircraft engines under license. Packard built 55,523 Rolls-Royce Merlins. Alcoa's aluminum output soared by 600%. Dow Chemical's magnesium production rocketed from 6 million pounds annually to an incredible 333 million. But the transformation of America's workforce was equally staggering, and it shattered every Nazi preconception. In 1941, women made up less than 1% of the aircraft industry. By 1943, they represented 65%, numbering 310,000 in aviation alone. At Douglas Long Beach, 22,380 of 41,620 employees were women. At Willow Run, Roswell Monroe, later immortalized as the original Rosie the Riveter, personally drove 3,000 rivets per shift with an astonishing 99.5% accuracy. The results spoke for themselves. Female inspectors at Douglas cut defect rates from 3.2% to just 0.3%. Ford engineers redesigned tools for smaller hands and, in the process, accidentally improved efficiency across the board. Pneumatic drills grew lighter, workstations more ergonomic, injuries fewer. German intelligence scoffed at these women, insisting their involvement was temporary and that quality would collapse. Instead, quality rose to unprecedented levels. Women excelled in wiring, instrumentation, and meticulous inspection. Their inclusion became a symbol of democracy's strength, voluntary cooperation trumping forced labor. Meanwhile, Germany descended deeper into fantasy. In February 1944, Göring authorized the Jaeger program, dispersing production in 729 underground sites run by slave labor. The middlework complex alone enslaved 60,000 prisoners, of whom 20,000 perished under horrific conditions. These factories produced more sabotage and defects than serviceable aircraft. Transportation between dispersed plants caused delays, and quality control collapsed. The entire middleware program produced fewer engines in a month than Ford's single Chicago plant. American innovation, by contrast, only accelerated. Boeing perfected modular B-29 Superfortress production across 4 geographically separate factories, each building interchangeable sections. The pressurized B-29, costing $65,000 apiece, represented a leap in technology Germany never managed to match, even in prototype. By early 1945, America was producing 100 B-29s monthly. On June 6, 1944, D-Day, the full scale of this industrial miracle was revealed. The Allies deployed 11,590 aircraft in support of the Normandy landings. The Luftwaffe managed just 319 sorties, a ratio of 36-1. This was not a tactical edge, but sheer industrial annihilation. Between January and May 1944, American bombing dropped 145,000 tons on German industry, more than Germany had dropped on Britain during the entire war. Allied transport aircraft delivered 3 airborne divisions in a single night, using more planes than Germany possessed in its entire transport fleet. By December 1944, single raids involved 1,200 bombers escorted by 900 fighters. The long-range P-51 Mustangs, with the range to reach Poland and the agility to outfly any opponent, swarmed the skies in such numbers that German pilots nicknamed them Indians for their ubiquity. Even in Nazi leadership, normally insulated by delusion, began to acknowledge the catastrophe. In December 1944, Joseph Goebbels wrote bitterly in his diary, "Göring's promises of Luftwaffe superiority now appear as criminal delusions. We are fighting the greatest industrial power in the world with nothing but rhetoric." Field Marshal Erwin Rommel warned his staff before D-Day. "The Americans can afford to lose 10 tanks for every one of ours and still crush us. When they land, they will come with such overwhelming material superiority that no defensive position can hold." Even Hitler himself, in January 1945, admitted privately to Albert Speer, "We should have listened to Boetticher's reports. Their industrial potential was decisive. While we built hundreds, they built tens of thousands." Speer later testified that American bombing reduced German tank output by 35%, aircraft by 31%, and trucks by 42%. The attacks followed a ruthless logic, systematically dismantling our ability to fight. They caused a breakdown of German armaments. Germany's one genuine technological triumph, the Me-262 jet fighter, entered service in mid-1944. It was faster than any Allied plane by over 100 miles per hour. Hitler and Göring convinced themselves that this wonder weapon would restore air superiority despite America's numerical supremacy. But Germany produced only 1,430 in total, with never more than 200 operational at once. Engines failed after just 10 hours. Shortages forced the use of inferior materials. America, meanwhile, had begun jet development back in 1942. While the Bell P-59 was underwhelming, Lockheed's P-80 Shooting Star entered production before war's end, a jet superior to anything in the German arsenal. This contrast defined the production war. Germany's brilliant prototypes could not compete with America's ocean of production. Quality without quantity meant nothing. Total war was decided not by ingenuity alone, but by industrial scale. That on May 8, 1945, Hermann Göring surrendered to the U.S. 36th Infantry Division. At first, he blustered in captivity, claiming that German technology had been superior and that the Reich had been defeated only by numbers. But at Camp Ashcan in Luxembourg, under intensive interrogation, his tone changed. In July 1945, Major Kenneth Heckler recorded Göring's admission. "I knew American industry was vast, but its execution exceeded even my darkest fears. That single factory at Willow Run produced more bombers than our entire Luftwaffe at its peak. It was incomprehensible." He expressed particular amazement at American logistics. "Your ability to supply armies across two oceans while maintaining domestic production was beyond imagination. We could not sustain forces 500 miles from Germany. You supplied armies 5,000 miles from America." At Nuremberg, prosecutors confronted Göring with charts showing America's monthly aircraft output surpassing Germany's annual totals by 1944. They played films of Willow Run's assembly lines while listing cities flattened by bombers from that one factory alone. Göring, usually defiant, fell silent. On March 14, 1946, under questioning, he confessed, "I always knew America's industrial and technical potential was unusually great, particularly in aviation. But I never imagined they could expand aircraft production 100-fold in 4 years. Such growth seemed physically impossible." Prison psychologist Gustav Gilbert later noted Göring's obsession with production statistics. He endlessly recalculated ratios, comparing individual American plants to all of Germany's combined output. He was fixated on Willow Run, referring to it bitterly as that damned factory that broke our backs. When shown that America had produced 812,615 aircraft engines compared to Germany's 241,675, Göring could only stare at the figures in silence. By late 1946, even Göring's bravado was wearing thin. At Nuremberg, as evidence mounted, he began openly comparing American productivity with German failure. He told fellow prisoner Albert Speer, "You and I were fighting mathematics, not machines." Once they entered the war, every factory, every assembly line, every rivet was against us. We never stood a chance. American prosecutors emphasized this relentlessly. They presented charts where Germany's total annual fighter production was matched by America's output in a single month. They showed reels of endless rows of P-51 Mustangs, hundreds of B-24 Liberators rolling off Willow Run, assembly halls in which women and men worked with precision and speed, all synchronized like the gears of an unstoppable machine. For Göring, this was the deepest humiliation. For years he had boasted to Hitler that the Luftwaffe would bring Britain to its knees, that Germany's technical brilliance could outfly and outfight any adversary. But here, under glaring lights and in the face of undeniable evidence, he was forced to admit the truth. The war in the air had not been lost because German pilots lacked courage. They had fought with unmatched ferocity, but because the Reich's production was dwarfed into irrelevance. Even Speer, who had fought desperately to increase output through centralized planning, now conceded, "No matter what I did, I could not overcome the avalanche of American production." Their system of decentralized factories, supported by powerful logistics, was immune to our bombing. They could replace in a week what took us months. As the trials dragged on, Göring's fascination with numbers became obsessive. Prison psychologist Gustav Gilbert recorded that Göring constantly asked for paper, sketching aircraft silhouettes beside production statistics, recalculating ratios late into the night. He would mutter phrases like, 8,000 in a month, impossible. How can one plant build more than our Reich in a year? His mind returned again and again to Willow Run, the plant he blamed as much as any general or battle for Germany's downfall. The irony was bitter. While Germany had enslaved millions to build weapons in caves and tunnels under the whip, America had invited women, immigrants, and ordinary workers into its factories and created an army of volunteers whose output surpassed anything ever seen. Göring, who once sneered at democracy as weak, now acknowledged that it was precisely democracy's inclusiveness that had forged this industrial miracle. Why October 1946? The verdicts at Nuremberg were handed down. Göring was sentenced to death by hanging. In the final days before his execution, his obsession with America's production never faded. To Speer, he said privately, "It was not your factories that failed, it was mine. I promised Hitler that I could defend the Reich with the Luftwaffe, but how could I, when across the ocean stood an arsenal greater than the world had ever imagined?" On the night of October 15th, Göring cheated the hangman by swallowing a hidden cyanide capsule. But in his cell, investigators discovered notebooks filled with production figures. America's numbers on one side, Germany's on the other, the vast gulf between them underlined again and again. His last written notes included the phrase, "The war was lost in the factories long before it was lost on the battlefield." And that was the ultimate truth. While German engineers created brilliant prototypes, while pilots fought with unmatched skill, and while propaganda boasted of wonder weapons, it was American industry that decided the war. Detroit's auto plants, Boeing's assembly lines, Willow runs bombers, and the countless women and men who labored day and night. They were the real arsenal of democracy that in just 4 years, America had transformed itself from a nation with fewer than 3,000 planes to one producing over 300,000. No empire in history had matched such a surge of industrial power. And when those planes filled the skies over Europe and the Pacific, when the bombers blotted out the sun and the fighters swarmed like locusts, there was no strategy, no courage, no technology that could resist them. The Luftwaffe, once the terror of Europe, was ground to pieces by the sheer weight of American production. Göring, who had sworn that no enemy bomber would ever fly over the Reich, lived to see not just hundreds, but thousands of them crossing German skies every day. And in the end, even he was forced to admit what Hitler never could, that the war was not won by speeches or ideology, but by factories, workers, and an industrial miracle unlike anything the world had ever seen. That miracle, America's arsenal of democracy, was the decisive weapon of the Second World War.